Considered by most Star Trek fans to be one of Deep Space Nine's best episodes, In the Pale Moonlight would explore the darker side of humanity and how sometimes the ends can justify the means. Originally titled Patriot, In the Pale Moonlight was written by Peter Allen Fields, with the teleplay written by Michael Taylor. Peter Allen Fields wrote numerous episodes for both Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, including TNG's Half a Life and Inner Light, as well as DS9's Duet, Progress, The Circle, Crossover, and For the Uniform, among others. Fields is also credited for creating the character of Elam Garak. Unfortunately, Peter Allen Fields died on June 19, 2019, and with his death, Star Trek truly lost a legendary and fantastic writer. Michael Taylor, on the other hand, was a Deep Space Nine and Voyager employee. He also worked on many episodes such as DS9's The Visitor and Things Past, as well as Voyager's Relativity, Shattered, Bride of Chaotica, and his favorite episode, Counterpoint. Michael Taylor would end up joining Ron Moore's writing staff for his show, Battlestar Galactica, during its third season. And Ronald Moore, who had also been involved with Star Trek before Galactica, had this to say about Taylor and Taylor's treatment on Voyager. To be blunt, Brian Fuller and Mike Taylor were treated very shabbily, and it really ticks me off. They took a lot of baloney, and the only reason it was done was to keep the guys on the top of the pyramid feeling good about themselves. It also had the effect of keeping the writing staff of Voyager from working in concert as a group. The DS9 staff, by contrast, was actually very tight. The story itself came from discussions in the writer's room about various pivotal moments in US history, including the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. This discussion spurred the powers that be to ask Fields to write a script based around political controversy involving a secret that, if discovered, could have huge consequences for Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets. The original story premise would have seen Jake effectively Watergating First Minister Shakar. He would discover a secret about Shakar's past in the Bajoran Resistance that, if the Bajoran people found out, would topple Shakar's government and bring chaos to Bajor once again. Jake would then tell his father about the secret, and Captain Sisko would attempt to stop his son from publishing it. Trying as hard as they could, the writers simply couldn't make Fields' story work, so they altered the premise to become a story of conflict between Jake and his father, where Jake was attempting to interview Garak for the Federation News Service, but when Garak's completely uninterested, Jake approaches his father to try to put some pressure on the eccentric Cardassian, to which Sisko refuses and tells Jake to stay away from Garak. This reaction from his father has, of course, the opposite effect on Jake, and instead he launches his own journalistic investigation where he uncovers a plot between his father and Garak to deceive the Romulan Empire in order to bring them into the war. This would make Jake conflicted and mistrusting of his father and his father's intentions and moral values. The final draft of the script was actually written by Ronald Moore, though he's uncredited for it and, of course, was the story we actually got. Jake was completely removed from the story because everyone felt that Jake and his father's relationship was simply too strong, and a relationship that was based on moral values. And the central conflict for the story just didn't work. Moore had this to say about it. It was really no contest between Sisko and Jake, because as much as we want to, it's hard to get those two characters to conflict with each other. So it didn't really ring true. Jake was so young and Sisko was so experienced, you really didn't believe the central conflict of the show. Two little side bits of Trek trivia for you. First, the title for this episode was actually a reference to the 1989 Tim Burton Batman movie, where the phrase,
"You ever dance with the devil in the pale moonlight?"
was spoken multiple times. And second, in the episode we hear that Betazed has fallen to the Dominion, but originally it was to be Vulcan that would have been invaded. But the writers quickly changed that, realizing that for the audience, Vulcans simply carried too much weight, and fearing riots in the Star Trek fan base, changed it to the less important but equally as recognizable Beta Z. This episode introduces Star Trek fans to a new Romulan starship, the Romulan Shuttle. This would be the first time the Romulans got a new starship since the introduction of the Romulan scout ship in TNG's episode The Defector. This episode dives deeply into humanity's psyche by exploring the topic of how, in times of war, great men sometimes have to put their morality aside for the greater good, a theme that is echoed from Deep Space Nine's episode for the uniform. Michael Taylor had this to say about the episode. It really showed how Deep Space Nine could stretch the Star Trek formula. It pushes the boundaries in a realistic way, because the decisions Sisko makes are the kinds of decisions that have to be made in times of war. Andrew Robinson, who played Garrick, rated this episode as one of his favorites and had this to say about it. Basically, it exposes the American innocence. That we want to do things in this world, but we're not really willing to take the consequences of our actions, and sometimes we have to do very dirty things. I don't think the other Star Trek shows really ever went as far as we did. Even Time magazine commented on how great this episode was, saying, "It was the best of the war episodes. The Federation is losing, friends are dying, the planet Beta Z has fallen, and Captain Sisko hatches a complicated plan to fabricate evidence showing that the Dominion wants to conquer Romulus. His aim is to bring the Romulans into the war on the Federation side. As Sisko gives up his principles slowly, one by one, in order to make this plan work, you expect Trek's simple moral values in the end to prevail. It is dumbfounding and chilling when they don't." Personally, I agree with these sentiments. When Star Trek Deep Space Nine dared to work outside the Star Trek box that had been coined by Star Trek The Next Generation and overused in Star Trek Voyager, it showed how a wonderful story that wasn't all alien flutes and horgons could fit expertly into the Star Trek universe. The exploration of the human core, its soul, could be as interesting as exploring strange new worlds and alien cultures. Deep Space Nine also didn't have to hide this exploration behind thinly disguised storylines, having bad guy aliens to represent humanity. This time, we got to see everything unfold for us, humanity, right in front of our eyes. Doing this also allowed us to see the big difference between Captain Jean-Luc Picard and Captain Benjamin Sisko. Both are true heroes, but for very different reasons. In contrast, Sisko was a hero because he could do shady things in order to get the job done, while Captain Picard was a hero for always doing the right thing. This type of conflict, where we as the audience have to consider and debate the reality of who we are as human individuals, is really a perfect example of Star Trek at its best. I think most of us can see exactly why both characters are who they are, and why both characters react the way they do. We can sympathize and understand them both. But the question really becomes, when push comes to shove, are you a Picard who would arrest Sisko for his deception towards the Romulan Empire? Or would you be the one to make those tough decisions like Sisko did in order to protect and help humanity and save thousands, if not millions of lives in the process, ignoring your own moral core? It really is a conundrum that I'm sure will be hotly debated by Star Trek fans for eternity. Just a few last comments that some fans of Star Trek tend to forget about this episode. The major one being that Starfleet supported the plan of deceiving the Romulans. That means that Sisko isn't solely responsible for all the actions taken. He was working with Starfleet's blessing. They gave him permission to deceive the Romulans. And the second point is that Sisko, though he was deceiving the Romulans, had no idea about Garrick's plans to kill Senator Vreenak. I'm not sure why, but many fans skip over or ignore these points in order to say Sisko is some type of villain. I'm not sure that if Garak had actually given his true plan to Sisko, that Sisko would have followed it. That's probably why Garak didn't tell him in the first place. I mean, Sisko isn't Janeway. Cold-blooded murder isn't something he just decides to do over breakfast. But its ending lines, with Sisko looking at the camera saying, "I can live with it," is a chilling but understandable statement. And loving or leaving Deep Space Nine as a series, I think it also echoes how many of us fans feel about this episode and how it fits in the Star Trek universe and Gene Roddenberry's vision for Star Trek. That I can live with it.
I can live with it.
Blackmail.
We had an agreement!
I'm making a new agreement. Treachery.
What we need to do is bring the Romulans into the war on our side.
Deception.
When they're finished with us, they're coming after you.
Tactics of war.
No one wants to see the Dominion destroyed more than I do.
Or Sisko's weapons of choice.
As far as you're concerned, you're working for me.
On the next Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short little trip into the behind the scenes of In the Pale Moonlight. What did you think of this episode? Are you a Picard or a Sisko? Well, leave me a comment in the section below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. Want to help the channel out behind the scenes? Then consider becoming a channel patron. The link to our Patreon account is in the description below. Thanks again for watching. Live long and prosper.
It's a fake.